Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I speak with Peter Gray. Peter is an evolutionary psychologist who's written an incredible book, Free to Learn, that really dives into how our kids learn, how our system in so many ways is failing them and causing them to have struggles, failure to thrive. Peter's work and Peter's experience really lays a different course for what development and education can be like. And so I'm excited to share this conversation with you, and I hope you get out of it as much as I have. So, Peter, you've written what in many respects I think is a pretty radical treatise on parenting and education and how we should think about a path to success for our kids. Your book, Free to Learn, it's had a huge impact on me. And in some respects, it's articulated things that I was feeling but didn't quite have the framework to think about. But before we get into the details of the book, tell me about your professional background. How did you come to be focused on this? Like, what do you do?
Well, I've been a professor of psychology and neuroscience all my adult life. I started off doing research on the brains of mice and rats, looking at the binding of certain hormones in the brain and how it affects behavior. Happily doing that kind of research. But then quite some time ago, actually it's close to 40 years ago, my son was rebelling in school. And so this didn't have anything to do with my research at the time, but it had to do with the person I love, one of the people I love, my son, terribly unhappy in school, constantly rebelling. His mother and I were constantly being called in to teachers' conferences about what are we going to do with this kid who refuses to follow the rules in school. I describe the scene in my book. I won't necessarily go through it here, but the end result of it was that he completely convinced us that he was absolutely not going to follow the rules in the school. And we were not going to win that fight. And so we found something different for him, something that he thought would be acceptable. And what we found was a radically alternative school called the Sudbury Valley School, which turned out not to be far from where we lived, a couple miles from us. At that time, he was not 10 years old. In those days, 10-year-olds could walk that far easily to school without an adult going with them. And so it was convenient. And he loved it. And I was interested in it. I was glad that he was happy. I was glad that we found something that seemed to him to work. But I was skeptical. I was at least somewhat skeptical. I'll describe as we go along how this school operates, but just very simply, this is a school that's completely unlike school as we think of it. It's a place where there are children there from age 4 on through what we think of as high school age, but they're not segregated into grades. They are not segregated into spaces. They can play and explore and follow their own interests however they want all day long as they don't break the school rules. And none of the rules have to do with learning. The rules just have to do with the kind of rules that any group of people need in order to get along with one another. Rules about not hurting the property, not hurting one another, not violating any state laws, and so on. But the rules were all made by school meeting in which everybody has a vote. So the principle of the school is that it operates democratically. And the assumption in this school is that if children are free and they have lots of opportunity to learn. You don't need to make them learn. They will learn. They'll figure out what they need to know. They'll figure out what they want to know, and they'll learn it. The staff members there don't, the school is still going on, so I'll use the present tense in describing it. Don't call themselves teachers because they don't believe they do any more teaching than anybody else at the school. They're just the adult members of this community, kind of take a major role in sort of the long-term decisions about the school and public relations and doing the kind of bureaucratic work that any school needs to do. So that was the school. And so my concern was, well, he's happy, but is he going to regret it at some point in his life? Would he be able to go on to college from such a school if he decided he wanted to go into a career that required college? Is his future going to be limited in some way? So I spent a little time at that time trying to find somebody to do a study of the graduates of the school. I thought people in the Department of Education at Boston College where I worked, or maybe over at Harvard, there were people who said they were interested in democratic education. I thought this would be a perfect opportunity for them, but I couldn't convince anybody to do that study. And
that's interesting. Why do you think that is, considering that it was it sounds like it's such a unique sort of petri dish?
I think it's because I think there's maybe two reasons. I think the first is that it's just really outside of the box of what people in education can think about. So even the people who call themselves interested in democratic education, they didn't really mean it. This is a school that really is democratic. They didn't really mean it. They use that language, but the idea that children could run a school and that children really without, there are progressive educators at Harvard and every place else who, they're all in favor of places like Montessori and other kind of progressive schools where the staff, gently guide the students in the right direction, give the students lots of choice. But this is not happening here. This is not happening in Sudbury Valley. The kids really and truly are in charge of their lives without adult intervention. And so it's just outside the box. I think that they thought this is a small and kind of irrelevant school to the larger issues that they were concerned about. I also think there's another thing, back in so this was around 1980 that I was starting to get interested in this. My son had already been there, a student there for a year or two.
And how old is your son now, just so we can kind of understand sort of?
He's 50.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He's 50 years old. So
and
he
hasn't collapsed into he's not still living with you? That's not happening?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
He's not. So, as
I wanted to get that out of the way.
I often say my initial study was motivated by my desire to not have him living in my basement when he's 50 years old, right? So
he can read.
No,
he's able to read the newspaper without assistance.
He's actually remarkably capable in all kinds of ways. So, but not just him. And so what I found, so I ended up doing a study of the graduates. So the school was already about 12 or 13, 14 years old. So there are already some students who had done basically all of what would be regarded as kindergarten through high school education there. And were now adults. And there were others who had been there for shorter periods of time. And there were about, if I remember right, something like 90 people who I considered to be graduates of the school, who had been there for what would have been at least their last 2 or 3 years of high school, and who did not go on to secondary education anywhere else. So they went on to adult life in one way or another. In some cases to higher education, in some cases more directly into careers or other routes for going on into careers. And what I found in that study first of all, it calmed my fears as a parent. The graduates were doing very well in life, remarkably well in life. And in fact, the results were so remarkable to me that it ultimately changed the direction of my career.
Wow.
I was continuing to do the brain research that I was doing, and I continued for some time, but I got more and more interested in, wow, I mean, here's a school that absolutely violates everything that we think about, that we as a society think a school needs to be. And and this is a time already, even back in 1980, we were already on this horrid path where we're increasing the amount of time children are spending in school, where we're making school more and more unpleasant, more and more, starting earlier with children, taking away recess gradually, taking away the fun things that used to be in school, making school more and more about drilling for multiple choice tests. And so here's the whole culture on this trend, and here's a school that just absolutely defies that, just says, we're taking all of this away. And amazingly, the kids are okay. As graduates, they come out okay. Not only okay, but to the degree that I could tell, they were doing better than the kind of students I was high school graduates I was meeting who were going on to Boston College and were my students. They knew more about what they wanted in life. They were intellectual. Most of them read a lot. Most of them, and this is regardless of what background they came from. This is not sort of a cream of the crop
Yeah,
group of
that's
kids.
gonna be my next question, right? Because I feel like the first
Yeah,
question people ask that have any sensitivity to
yeah,
this sort of study or this sort of sample of people is, well, is this selection bias? Is this wealthy families in upper middle class Massachusetts whose kids have every advantage, and does the school screen for smart kids, and so you end up with the cream of the crop who are going to succeed sort of no matter. You could put them in a burlap sack and leave them in your backyard, and they're probably going to end up doing all right. They're high IQ. They're high.
yeah,
Their
yeah.
social
Yeah,
support's
no,
high. What's the
absolutely not. I mean,
situation?
what's interesting is, so there's, people sort of have two impressions of the school. One is people who hear about the study of the graduates think, oh, this must be the cream of the crop. Other people think, oh, these are the dropouts, these are the dregs, these are the people who can't make it at regular school. And there's a certain sense in which both of them are right. There's some cream of the crop kids who go there who hate school because it's so boring and unchallenging and so on. There are a few of that in category, and I think I'll say I think my son was probably in that category. Not that he was from a wealthy family, but he's bright. He was a bright kid. Um, but then there's a lot of kids who go there truly because they were failing in public school. I should say this is not, the people who are coming from another school are not coming from private schools. This is not a wealthy group. Wealthy people send their kids to fancy prep schools. This is a school that is primarily kind of middle class. To be honest, it's primarily middle class. It's not a lot of people from poor families because there is a tuition charge, although it's very low compared to other private schools. But people come for all kinds of reasons. There are some people who come because they believe in this from the beginning. They're kind of maybe hippie types in a sense, if we can still use that language. And some of them who send their children out of desperation, a little bit the way I did. To me, it wasn't total desperation because I was intrigued by this. I wasn't rejecting it right from the beginning. I thought this was an interesting possibility. But there are a lot of families that that they have this problem child, and so the problem child goes there, and then once you've got the problem child there, it's pretty hard to send your other children who are not the problem children to public school, so they also go there. So I could not find there's a whole range of people who go there in terms of their background. And nowadays, at that time, at that time, I was just looking at Sudbury Valley. Now there are many other schools modeled after Sudbury Valley. Some of them have much more diverse populations. So, for example, the Circle School in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, is right in the middle of the city. It has a very diverse group of populations. The average income, the range of income, very much reflects the city. And they've actually done a study of graduates that in which they look at people who are very low income and how they've done, and even the low income people, the low income graduates are doing very well. And they have a sliding scale, so if you're low income, you pay very little to go there, or even maybe nothing in some cases. There's now another school called the Philly Free School in Philadelphia, which is modeled in part after Sudbury Valley, operates in a very similar way, also in the center of the city, also attracting a wide range of people. Lots of people from the African American community, people who are also getting very reduced tuition. I visited the school. There's been no study of the graduates that so far. It's been a somewhat newer school. But boy, it looked to me like everybody was doing really well there. So this is absolutely not a school that's for the elite. This is a school that seems to work for a wide range of people. And in fact, I've become convinced that this kind of education is especially valuable for people who don't have a lot of the privileges at home that middle-class people have. And the reason I say that is because what this school provides is something like what a educationally rich home provides. It provides the opportunity to get to know people from a whole range of society. It's an environment where a lot of reading is going on. It's an environment where people are playing games that involve numbers. It's an environment where you hear people engage in philosophical discussions. It's an environment in which all kinds of ideas are on the table and being talked about. So this is the kind of environment that promotes education, and if it's the case that kids in poor families are growing up, because of poverty, they don't have books surrounding them. Their parents maybe don't have much time to read or to read to them, or maybe even aren't good at reading, or don't think of reading as something that is important to do, or maybe that's an environment in which you don't know anybody who would be personally. You go to see a doctor, but you don't know if nobody in your neighborhood is a doctor or is a lawyer or is a businessman and so on. So you don't have contact with real people who represent this range of life. You don't know people who went to college. So now you're suddenly in this environment where there are staff members who went to college. They know what it's like to get there. They can tell you about it. They can tell you what you've got to do to go there. If you decide you want to go there, how to get a scholarship, and so on and so forth. They can advise you. So you're now in an environment where you've got the privileges that you would have if you were in a middle class or a wealthy home.
The interesting thing about your book and about where this experience takes you is you spend a fair amount of time talking about the problems with the current sort of predominant sort of experience of quote education, which is we are segmented by age and we march year by year through this highly structured block of time, and most of us, I think it's over 95% of Americans today are going to a typical traditional run-of-the-mill sort of public school, and so we're all experiencing this. So when it's got to be very difficult to get through to parents who feel like they're doing fine and came up through this, what they believe to be this system that's like what their kids are going through, and say, like, well, I turned out great and I went to public school. What's the problem? So that's the first like question, but it relates to the second, which is, what's wrong with having teachers and having subjects and so and having the structure that most people experience. Your son obviously didn't like it, but maybe he's the outlier. Maybe most kids are perfectly fine. What's the problem with the way things are today?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you certainly can find people, adults who are in the category that you've just described, who say, school worked really well for me. I'm happy with my life. I'm glad I went to school. Turns out if you dig a little deeper, you don't necessarily find that when you interview adults. Let me refer to it. There's a book that Kirsten Olson, who at the time was a graduate student at Harvard Education School, did a thesis in which she kind of believed what you just said initially. She kind of believed that school's a good thing. People get inspired at school. People go on. And so she thought she would do her doctoral dissertation by interviewing people who are doing very well in life and trying to find out what happened in school that helped them do well in life. This was going to be a very positive book about the experiences of school. And what she found is, once she got people talking, they kept talking about how they hated school. They kept talking about how school almost led them to not pursue what they ended up loving to do and ended up achieving. It's a little bit like at the extreme, not that Einstein was included in her group, but Einstein often said, after I was forced to study mathematics in school, I couldn't stand mathematics. It took me 2 or 3 years to recover before I went on to it. But she was getting kind of responses like that. She ended up writing a book called Wounded by School. And she ended up interviewing people, not just people who were doing really well in life, but a whole wide range of people about their school experiences, and ended up with separate chapters on the ways that people felt wounded by school. So, if you scratch the surface, it's not really the case that the great majority of adults are really, if they really think about it, are really happy with their schooling. So that's one point to make. The other point to make is, in truth, school is much worse today than it was years ago. Much worse. And the reason is because there's more of it and there's less flexibility within it. So when I compare school today, and even school in the 1970s and late 1970s and into the 1980s when my son was starting school, when I compare school then even to when I was in school in the 1950s, school was already on a trend of getting worse. The school year keeps getting longer. The school year is now 5 weeks longer than it was in the 1950s when I was a kid. Recess has been gradually taken away. When I was in elementary school, we had 6-hour school days, but 2 of those hours were outdoors. We had half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, a full hour at lunch, and we could play however we wanted. There weren't teachers constricting how we could play. I don't think teachers were even watching. If they were, they didn't intervene. So, which means we were never in our seats more than an hour at a time. And also this was a time when, in the past, teachers, for the most part, are really loving and good people who go into teaching because they love children, could do pretty much what they wanted in the classroom, and they could adjust what they were doing in accordance with their perceptions of how the kids were responding. But this has gradually changed over time. Schools have become increasingly, what teachers can do is increasingly dictated by a hierarchy that never sees the kids and doesn't really understand child development. And the result is that teachers are doing things that even the teachers recognize are harmful to the children, which is one of the reasons I've written a couple of blog posts recently on the huge numbers, especially of kindergarten teachers who are quitting because they're being forced to do what they see as harmful in the school. So, but this has been a gradual change of increased top-down direction, driven by data having to do with test scores, and the tests have nothing to do with real world abilities. They just have to do with things that the testers have decided to test on, that you can test with multiple choice tests. And schools have become increasingly oriented to that. So they become less and less relevant to children's lives, and even less and less relevant to the ultimate lives of the adults who will be growing through those schools. And more people are recognizing that.
So it's funny. So much of this resonates with me. And for listeners who've heard some of my past conversations with Lenore Skenazy or with Jeff Sandifer, who with his wife Laura founded the Acton Academy, where my son goes to school, which is maybe a only slightly more structured Sudbury. It all rings true. When I think back to my school years, particularly K through 12. And I'm 42, so I graduated high school in '96. I remember almost entirely the things that I did self-directed after school, which was making videos, drawing cartoons, building RC cars, and generally pursuing things that were exciting. And school, I was a decent student. I was like, I had like a 3.3. And that 3.3 was because I would get A's in the classes that I liked and struggle to pass the classes that I didn't like because I just had no interest in them. And
Right.
And it just felt like such an enormous amount of time wasting every day.
Right.
Like, why am I? And you'd cram for a test, and you'd take the test, and then you'd immediately forget, because cramming is a terrible way to learn anything. So you'd immediately forget what it is that you just were tested on. And then when I look back, it's hard. I struggle to think about or summarize what it was I learned that was essential. I mean, I learned how to read, but obviously kids learn how to read pretty easily. And this is obviously, to a lot of folks, it just sounds like absolute heresy to say these things out loud.
Right.
But that was just my experience, just like exactly the way you're describing.
Right.
And then it was funny because, it's interesting that you said that you're seeing this kindergarten teachers in particular sort of dropping out of the profession. When I lived in New Jersey, I sent my son to a Catholic school down the street, and Catholic schools mostly track with the public schools. And he was in kindergarten, and he just hated it. He just and I didn't understand why he hated it. Like, I have pictures of him being pulled into the classroom, screaming at the top of his lungs. And I know, when I paid attention to what was going on, he was getting worksheets, and it looked more like second grade than kindergarten to me. And I actually asked the principal, who had a classic nun name. She's a very nice lady, but you could tell like the kids were also probably terrified, or like Sister Mary Frances or something like that. I'm sorry that I don't remember off the top of my head, but I said, has kindergarten changed? Am I misremembering? And she said, no, it's very much changed. I said, well, why? Because it kind of sucks. She's like, I agree it sucks, but unfortunately we have to do this because the parents expect us to keep up with what's happening in the public schools. And that kind of like what you were experiencing with your son, I mean, that led us, when we moved, to pursue radically different education models, because I just could see, it's like, if this is what's already happened to kindergarten, I just can't imagine that it gets better with time.
Yeah. No, it used to be that if you interviewed kids about whether they like school and so on, you would find it'd be about middle school when they would say they hated school. Now they're hating school even in kindergarten. And that is what the kindergarten teachers are reporting. They're hearing little kids saying, I hate school. I hate coming here. I hate being here. Can you imagine that? The belief, yeah, how can anybody believe that a place where people hate being is a place where children should be, and that is somehow conducive to learning, to be in that situation? No, it's just absolutely insane what we're doing, and it's becoming more and more insane all the time, and more people are recognizing that. Unfortunately, not fast enough, but an increasing number of people are taking their kids out of school. We're now up to something like 4% of American school children are being homeschooled, and others beyond that are going to schools, alternative school, to the degree that people can afford and find a place to take them. It's still a small number, but it's a growing number, and so that's beginning to happen. But no, it's insane. It's driven by it's partly one of the reasons this has occurred is over time we've shifted the way schools are financed increasingly, so that initially, when I was a kid, they were financed primarily by local government. So schools were local decisions made by school boards that knew the kids, knew the parents. There was a lot of common sense involved. For reasons that seemed very reasonable, we moved to a system where there was a considerable amount of state financial aid for schools, and then beyond that, federal financial aid for schools. Well, of course, when there's financial aid, it comes with strings attached. And so the financial aid is hooked on some policies that get developed by people who know nothing about kids, by people who are looking at test scores, by people who say, they see, on the PISA tests, the Chinese, and by the way, it's a very selected group of Chinese,
Right.
are scoring so much higher than we are. Well, what are they doing differently than us? Oh, I see what they're doing. They're keeping kids in school all the time. And so we're going to do that. And so we're not embarrassed by having lower PISA test scores that they have. I mean, that's the kind of thing that drove it. That was the kind of thing that began with No Child Left Behind and all of that kind of stuff, as if those tests are important. And nobody was really looking at the fact that there's a huge rate of childhood suicide in China. China was producing people who were good at tests, but not good at much else. And the Chinese government was even recognizing that. At the same time we were trying to model China, there were people from China coming over here to try to figure out what we're doing, because we're winning the Nobel Prizes and so on and so forth. And what is it about our school that produces creative people, and why can't they produce creative people? And so they were trying to find ways to loosen up their schools at the same time, because they were looking at things that are much more important than test scores, like what are people actually doing in adulthood? And what about the mental health of people? So it's very interesting that how these policies get made. And, think of the metaphors that we've developed for school. No child left behind. What a terrible metaphor. It's as if, we're all on the same track. School is running along the track, and some people are behind and some people are ahead. And we've got to do things so everybody gets pushed up to the same point, as if that's the point of school, it's like a race. You're going along the same track. There's no thought here about what the purpose of school is. Why do we want everybody to be the same? Or even worse than that, uh, what is the new one? Race to the top. Race to the top. I love Obama, but that metaphor for school that came out of the Obama administration, race to the top. Top of what? Is that our goal? Is that the way we want to think of the world and think of education? How do you get to the top? What does it even mean to be at the top?
It's a very zero-sum framing too, right? Because a race has winners
Yeah.
and losers, and that's not really the way your life works. I can race to a different I'm racing to my own destination that has nothing to do with what you're racing to, and
Yeah,
there's
I
no
mean,
top
let's
or
look at you and
bottom.
me. Let's look at you and me. Who's ahead right now? You or me, right? You know what to say. Oh, wow, that's a stupid question, right? I mean, we're on different
No, I'm
tracks.
going to beat you, Peter.
Yeah. Yeah, we're on different tracks. You know, and so you look at kids at Sudbury Valley or a school like that, and it makes no sense to say who's ahead and who's behind. No sense at all. They're all on different tracks. They're doing different things. They've got different interests. So, there are some people who learn to read real early because they're interested in reading. There are other people who are doing just amazing things that don't involve reading, and then they learn to read later on when they realize there's a need to learn to read. The thought that it's like a race just dissolves as soon as you look at people in real life. And when you look at school, it's, if there's a metaphor, if you want to have an analogy for education, it's not a racetrack, it's some kind of a bush or a tree, and you can go out on this limb or you could go out on that limb, and you can take as much time as you want and develop a nice thick limb, or you can go farther out and develop a long limb. You know, it's there's this idea that it's something that we can measure, that we can weigh, that we can see who's ahead and who's behind, and we've got to push the people who are behind. The whole thing is to find ways that in which we present information, we present the world in such a way that kids can figure out what they want to learn and can then learn it and pursue it. And when kids are, you know, people talk about, you know, you kind of raise the question, are those kids at Sudbury Valley brilliant? And yes, they are. But all kids are brilliant when they're doing what they want to do. Essentially, all kids are brilliant. They're amazing. They're built for learning. They're built for getting interested in things and absorbing what they want when they're interested. The same kid who looks stupid when you're trying to make him learn something that he's not interested in, doesn't want to learn right now, that same kid looks brilliant when he or she is doing what that person is interested in.
Now, one objection I've heard from some parents when I talk to them about either my son's school or just about these criticisms with the how much school sucks is you know, in some ways I'm still a 13-year-old, so I can't help but basically boil it down to school sucks. It's just like, it's very visceral for me. I remember, to just go off on a side for a second, the winds of September, because I grew up in the Philadelphia area, so we have the now I'm in Texas, but we used to have, you know, seasons, and that cold wind of September blowing just sent emotional chills down my spine that school was starting every year. It was like, it was always just this. It was a wind of depression. But you know, I will hear multiple parents say, "Well, you know, isn't it important for them to learn that life's not all about fun and all about pursuing what you want, and that you're going to have to do things at times, and whether it's entry level jobs or just the job you end up being able to have that isn't great, and you need to be able to perform anyway, and that's life. Life's not a box of chocolates."
Right.
You know, how do you respond to that when in thinking about skills? Like, is there a value in learning to survive rote work and boring bureaucracy?
Right. And I think that there was a time in our history where you could make the case. That was never a good case, but you could make the case that we needed people in our economy who could do really boring work and persist at it. Who People who could memorize a lot of information and feed it back, people who could crunch numbers, you know, over and over and over again in a boring way. There was a time when we needed people like that. We had assembly lines. We needed accountants needed to be able to do long division. You know, we needed people to do all that kind of stuff. We don't need that anymore. We don't, the people can't get jobs doing that anymore. This has all been replaced by robots. It's all been replaced by computers, if you want to know the answer to something, you Google it. You don't have to remember it in your head. You don't need to remember the names of the capitals of all the states. If you want to know the capital of any given state, it takes you about 2 seconds to find it, Googling it. This idea that we need people who could do all this boring stuff, and because the jobs are so boring, is simply no longer true. What we
Now, Peter,
need in
just
our
to push for
culture.
just a second, just to,
Sure.
I stopped at a McDonald's. That's not a great high cognitive job that kid is doing at the checkout, but it's an important one. It might be his first job or her first job. So, are you overstating the need, the lack of need for some basic skills?
First of all, the basic skills that you need for McDonald's, or the basic skills that you need for any activity in life, are so easily learned and so naturally learned. Everybody learns them if you are growing up in a world where these are present. So it is important to know how to read. But there has never been a student at Sudbury Valley who hasn't learned how to read. They all learn how to read. There are by now thousands of graduates in the school. Everybody's learned how to read, even though reading is not taught there. Everybody learns how to read. Everybody learns how to use numbers and to use and understands what adding and subtracting and multiplying are, and dividing, just by virtue of living life. You cut recipes in half in the kitchen because you're interested in cooking, or you're building things and you're measuring boards and so on. We live in a literate and numerate environment. In Sudbury Valley, the kinds of homes that do homeschooling and unschooling, particularly, the kinds of environments in which self-directed education occurs, are literate and numerate environments. And if you're growing up in that environment, you're going to learn how to read. You're going to not necessarily learn how to handwrite these days, but you're going to learn how to type. You're going to learn how to construct meaningful sentences, because you can't grow up these days without communicating by texting and so on and so forth. Everybody's learning that stuff. You don't need school for it.
It's one of the things that I've heard from a wide variety of sources. And again, I think this one of the clouds that hangs over our conversation is the kids these days sort of bias, right? The sense that, well, everybody always thinks everything's getting worse for the next generation. But I have heard a lot of complaints from a lot of different quarters that current college graduates are coming out fundamentally less functional and less prepared for life than used to be the case, in a whole host of ways. Not just basic problem solving, basic. I'm going to seek out how to deal with the challenge that confronts me. There seems to be a strong bias towards being asked for direction and not knowing what to do without it. And then there's also a sort of inability to deal with adversity, especially just in social circumstances. Even the smallest one can induce a run to HR. Somebody says something that's forget even offensive, just something that just puts you off for some reason. And it's off to HR you go, or even to call your parents, even in your early 20s, which would be shocking to me. But I've heard this from HR professionals. I've heard it from employers. You spend a fair amount of time in your book talking about what has happened with the mental, well-being and the mental capacity of young people that are going through this increasingly regimented, bureaucratized, hyper-scheduled childhood. What's been your observations of this world that the top-down schooling has wrought for us?
Right. Yeah, well, first of all, I would confirm what you've just said. I've also heard this from employers, and there's been a fair amount written about this. I don't know of systematic evidence about it. There's more systematic evidence about what's happening in college. So, same thing, you hear the same thing from college professors. Students are coming in wanting to be told exactly what to do and exactly how to do it. Not wanting to do anything that there's some creativity involved, some risk involved, some maybe I would fail if I did it my own way. I want to know exactly the right way to do it. Professors are hearing that more and more all the time. The other thing that's happening in colleges is that, and there's been a lot written about this, a lot of concern about it, is that the mental health centers are overwhelmed. Students are having emotional breakdowns about all kinds of things that in the past would have been things that that would have been regarded as, bumps in the road of life. This is something that people go through and you figure out how to solve it. Life is not always rosy. There are problems. You have romantic breakups and you get over it. You get a bad grade in a class and it's not the end of the world, and so on and so forth. But for many students now, the bad grade seems like the end of the world. It seems like a terrible, absolutely, they're going to be homeless, they believe. We have here's my analysis of what has happened. So over the years, children have become less and less free, more and more controlled from birth on almost. So it used to be that kids spent a lot of time out with other kids with no adults telling them what to do. You would get into trouble and you'd have to find your way out of trouble. You would get lost and you'd find your way home. Your best friend today hates you tomorrow, and you figure out how you're going to deal with it. You run into some bullies and you figure out what you're going to do about this. You figure out how to solve your own problems. That's growing up. That's part of what the world of childhood is all about, and what it's always been all about. It's one of the reasons why children by nature want to get away from adults, even though it's not always pleasant away from adults. Even though you know that you're away from adults, that means there's not going to be that protective person there to protect you, but yet children want to get away from adults. And in the past, they always did. They always did. And that is how you grow up. You learn how, when you're away from adults, you have to kind of be the adult. You have to kind of figure out how to solve your problems. And it starts relatively small. You start when you're very young, you're playing out for a little bit away from adults with other kids, but your mom is not right there to pick you up immediately. Your mom is not right there to, or the other kid's mom is not right there to scold that other kid if he's being a little bit mean to you. So you figure out how to do things, and you start off small because when you're little, you have a little bit of this kind of freedom. But by the time you're 8 or 9 or 10, you've got a lot of it. And also by the time you're 8 or 9 or 10, you can deal with a lot of it. And by the time you're 18, you can deal with a heck of a lot of it. But now we don't allow children to solve their own problems. We've got them. We believe that it's the adult responsibility to be constantly watching them, constantly monitoring, constantly making sure that they don't run into difficulties. It's even, I hear from people who think it's bullying if you don't invite somebody to your birthday party, Oh my
Well,
God,
the
how could that
FOMO, the
person?
fear of missing out when you're on your kid's Instagram account is
But yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, that's right. Or God forbid, your kid is going to be playing in a soccer game and you are not going to be able to be there. Oh, what torture to the child. That's what has become of us. When I was a kid, and when I was a kid was normal childhood. it wasn't just the 1950s. This was normal childhood. This was normal childhood throughout the world and throughout time, except for times when children were slaves, times and places of childhood slavery and really intense childhood labor. But you look at any traditional society, you look at the way children are. And I've talked with a lot of anthropologists who study children all over. Children everywhere throughout time spend more time away from adults with other children than they spend with adults. This has always been true, and it was true when I was a kid. We were out playing with other kids in the 1950s more than we were in school. And even if we were home, it's true that if you count sleeping and so on, we're in the presence of adults at home more often. But if you count the daytime hours, you're spending enormous amounts of time away from adults, and you're learning how to run your life. We're not letting young people learn how to run their life. And moreover, we're putting them now in a school situation where fear of failure becomes ever more the curriculum. It's like if we have now all these honors classes and advanced placement classes, and for people who are achievement oriented, they feel they've got to be in those classes, and they feel if they don't get A's in those classes, they failed. And of course these views get exaggerated. They begin to think, oh my God, I'll be homeless. If I don't get into some elite college, I'll never make it in life. We've convinced children of that. We've made children so afraid of their own future and of the world and of failure. And that's why now the student who gets a B, in a class in school some students, not all by any means, have an emotional breakdown about it. There's interesting, one of the psychological clinical tests that I think is very telling. It's called the Rotter's Internal-External Locus of Control Scale, and it assesses the degree to which you feel that you are in charge of your own life versus the degree to which you feel that you are kind of a victim of powerful other people, of circumstance, of luck, and so on and so forth, things that you can't control. And so internal locus of control means that you tend to be on the side of believing I'm in control of my own fate. External means I am being controlled by things outside of my control. Ever since this test was developed in the 1960s, and there's a version of this for school-age kids, but for school-age kids and for college kids, the sense of internal locus of control has been continuously going down ever since this was developed around 1960, such that, in fact, it's gone down in a whole standard deviation, which, stated a little bit differently, it means that in terms of the degree to which you have an internal locus of control, the average person today would be at the 15th percentile in the 1960s. In other words, 85% of people in the 1960s would have had a bigger and more internalized locus of control than the average young person has today. I think this is very telling. How do you develop a sense of control over your own life if you never have control over your own life? If you are growing up always being controlled, if you're always got an adult around telling you what to do. School has become more and more controlling. School is more and more about doing what you're told to do in school, less and less recess, less and less art, where at least you've got some freedom of what to do, less and less flexibility on the part of teachers to develop kind of creative activities in the classroom. We used to write a lot of stories and so on and so forth, where it's creative. It's the teacher isn't telling you what the story should be. You're making it up, right? There's less and less of that. And so you take children's opportunity to control their own lives away, and they're not going to know how to control their own lives once they become young adults.
You also reference a decline So that locus of control is a really interesting one. You also talk about the declines in happiness, declines in creative thinking, and rises in anxiety and depression, and also rises in narcissism. So open up the aperture on this changing psychological profile from 1950s versus today.
Yeah. So the what the research shows is that. So let's take happiness. The opposite of happiness, let's say, is depression. So there's the uh, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, standardized clinical battery of tests, which includes a scale for measuring depression. Version of this for adolescents has been given actually since the 1940s in unchanged form to normative groups of young people over the decades.
What does that mean,
You
normative
look
groups?
that means that these are scientifically selected groups so as to be representative of the whole social class spectrum and so on, so that you are getting a representation. Although you're not testing everybody in America, you're getting a representation. It's sort of the way polls are done
Gotcha.
and so on, where you want to try to assess what's happening overall to the whole population. So this has been given to normative groups of young people over the years. If you look at what the cutoff point would be for suspected major depressive disorder today, between the 1950s and the end of the 20th century, between the 1950s and the year 2000, the increase in major depressive disorder by that assessment was somewhere between 6 and 8-fold. In other words, somewhere between 6 times and 8 times as many people would be young people suffering from major depressive disorder since the year 2000. Now, we don't have analyzed data from that test that I know of, but other measures have indicated that depression has continued, has perhaps doubled since then, since 2000. So if that's true, then it would be about maybe as much as 16 times as many people suffering from major depressive disorder now as in the 1950s. There's another scale that assesses on a different kind of test that assesses what today would be called generalized anxiety disorder. And again, very similar results. Huge increases in anxiety. The suicide rate for school-age children today is at least 6 times, based on the last data I've been able to find, was 6 times what it was in the 1950s. All of these are gradual increases. So just as children's opportunity to play and explore and be free, do their own thing, has been going down, these measures of unhappiness and anxiety have been increasing.
I've witnessed this. My son is 14, and I've witnessed this among his peers. I want to say that he seems to be pretty well adjusted, but of course, we as parents, we're always living in fear of what we don't know with what's going on with our own kids. So I don't want to overstate how well my own son is doing, because who knows. But
Right.
I have the number of kids who have been given some sort of pharmaceutical over the past decade, or have complained about varying kinds of psychological disorders, and they know the disorder and they talk about it as a disease. It has shocked me, and it isn't until I've become sensitive to your work and what's happened that there's been some way of understanding why this would be going on. And because a lot of the things that I would think you'd try to pin it on don't hold a lot of water. Like, well, it's a scarier world. It's like, well, is it a scarier world than the Cold War, or
Right.
the assassination of JFK, or the 60s and 70s? I mean, is it really scarier than that? there's this concern that the world's less safe, which is false on every single conceivable metric and dimension, from crime to poverty to basically across the board. So that's just some, if it bleeds, it leads news stories or something. That's, I mean, why do you think this is happening at like a meta level? Is it, so because it feels like there's a lot of forces at work that are all pushing in one direction. You have this increased top-down schooling on one hand, and then you have this increased fear and anxiety, not just from the kids, but also from the parents on the other hand. And that seems like a kind of vicious feedback loop.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it should be no surprise to us whatsoever that you take away play, which we've largely done. Play is activity that children choose themselves. They're in control of it. They're not being controlled by adults. They're following their own interests. They're doing it just because it's fun, not for some reward. This is all the definition of play. Play is how happiness is maintained. Take away play and you take away happiness. There's one of the leading researchers in play, Brian Sutton Smith, who died a couple of years ago, used to say the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. So it should be no surprise whatsoever that we deprive children of play, real play, and they become depressed. Of course they do. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. And yet when people talk about, I was listening to NPR the other day. I tend to turn it on when I do my morning exercises, and the new superintendent of schools for the Boston public school system was on talking about all the mental illness and so on that they have to do with. And so she was coming up with all the reasons that there's mental illness. And so she was mentioning everything except what is so clear, the real causes. The fact that children are not free, and the fact that school has become extremely stressful. She talks about, we want to blame it on technology. Everybody wants to blame it on technology. Everybody wants to say, oh, it's
cell phones and social media.
Those computer games and social media, that's what makes people depressed. I've examined the evidence. It is simply not there. It is simply not there. We take there's studies that show tiny little suggestions of an effect, and they get all blown out of proportion. When you take all the data combined, and there are by now lots of review articles, if anything, video games are improving mental health.
I like to hear that as a gamer myself. So,
yeah, well, I'll give you an example. There was a study done by Columbia University, in the School of Mental Health there, 3,000 school-age children between the age of 6 and 11, if I remember right. And they looked at how much time they spend playing video games based on, I believe, their parents' reports of how much time they spend playing video games. And they then, independently of that, they used teachers' ratings to assess how socially mature the kids were, how socially competent they were, how many friends they had, how emotionally stable they were, and how well they were doing in school. On every measure, those who were playing more video games did better than those who were not playing video games. On every measure. And to me, that doesn't surprise, because in a world today where almost the only way to play is to play on video games, because you're not allowed to play in other ways. You're not allowed to just go outdoors if you're between 6 and 11 years old and find other kids to play with away from adults. The only way you can play away from adults is online. And so to me, it's no surprise that those kids who are doing that are better off in every way than those who are not. I could go on and on about this, but it's amazing how we refuse to look at the elephant in the room. We refuse to look at what's staring us in the face. There's an old saying in psychiatry that is all too often ignored, which is if you want to know what's bothering somebody, ask them, right? And so if you ask children what's bothering them, it's school, not just school. Yeah, I'll give you an example. The American Psychological Association did a study about 4 years ago. It was, I guess maybe it's 5 years ago now. It was published, I think, in 2015, of called Stress in America. So they were looking at again, this was sort of a normative study, people of all ages. They were looking at assessing at how stressed they were, how anxious and stressed they were. And the first thing they found was that teenagers are the most stressed out people in America. And the other thing they found is that 83% of teenagers said it's school that's stressing me. And yet here's the superintendent of schools of a major school district who's talking about what is it that's stressing people, and she refuses to say schools are stressing people.
Well, there's that old Upton Sinclair quote that a person will not understand what their paycheck depends on them not understanding, right?
I think that's true. But, so schools are doing everything. The other thing that's happening is schools have become places for therapy. There's more and more new jobs for therapists in schools. So we treat it with therapy as if, all right, this is, the problem is the kids. The problem is that the kids need therapy. Instead of treating it by saying, wait a minute, what really is causing this problem? Why are these kids depressed and anxious? And what can we do to make the world less depressing and anxious for them? We've become a therapy-oriented society.
It's interesting to think about that rise, because is there any portion of that we should cordon off to say that is positive, in the sense that, like many things in our society, we've become more sensitive to people's challenges? And so is there some percentage of this reporting that is surfacing something that was a real problem that was simply being ignored in the past?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm not saying that I'm against therapy for people who need therapy, but I'm saying, well, let's ask the question, why do so many more people need therapy?
Right.
And is therapy always the answer, or is it better to say, wait a minute, what's the problem that's leading this person to therapy, and how can we solve that problem? So, the in some cases you can't in an immediate sense solve it for that person except through therapy. The person has been damaged because they've grown up with overprotective parents, and they haven't learned how to solve their own problems, and maybe they need therapy to learn techniques and so on for solving their own problems, for dealing with problems. But but when kids are saying, when 83% of kids are saying that school is stressing me out, and we respond to that data with more therapists in school, instead of responding it by saying, well, why is school so stressful, and how can we make it less stressful?
How much of this is projection on the part of us as adults? It's like, well, my life is stressful, so of course our kids are going to be stressed, and they're.
But isn't it interesting that our kids are more stressed than we are? Isn't that sad? Why should a 15-year-old be more stressed than you at 41 or whatever you are, right? Why?
That is, yeah, that difference is really strange.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things. Now that middle school and teenage time is also a time of really weird, development. Right? It's the hormones are raging, and how much of that might be natural. That, well, of course, it's you're like you're literally getting. My son has stretch marks on his back from growth, and how much of that sort of stress might be related to that. Is that something that's a legitimate?
What I can say is when you're looking at kids at that age and you're comparing kids at that same age in the 1950s with today, something like 10 times as many of them are stressed out today than was true in the 1950s. Hormones haven't changed.
Right.
Biology hasn't changed. The world has changed. When you ask anthropologists and one of my research, one of the ways I've done research is to survey anthropologists who have observed kids in hunter-gatherer cultures and other kinds of pre-state cultures. When you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, there's no measures of it. We can't say this with statistical certainty. But when I ask the anthropologists, does depression, anxiety, do these disorders exist among children in hunter-gatherer cultures? And the answer is no. Doesn't exist.
So that you spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about this what life and what learning is like in hunter-gatherer cultures as sort of sampled across all these anthropologists. Can you just sort of paint that picture for me? Because it's a vivid picture in the book.
Yeah, well, I got interested in hunter-gatherer cultures because I'm a biologically oriented psychologist. I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I'm interested in how our basic, my interest in education is I'm interested in what is it about our basic biology that leads us to educate ourselves. And so I got interested through the great bulk of our history, through depending on when you consider human beings to have, when you consider our ancestors to originally be human beings, if you think of that, some people pin that as about 1,000,000 years ago. For at least 99% of that 1,000,000 years, we were all hunter-gatherers. It wasn't until about 10,000 years ago that agriculture first emerged. So we all evolved as hunter-gatherers. We all evolved in the kinds of conditions that hunter-gatherers would be living in. Well, it turns out there are groups of hunter-gatherers that managed to survive as hunter-gatherers into modern times. As late as the mid to even towards the late 20th century, excuse me, it was still possible for anthropologists to trek out into various parts of the world, isolated parts of the world, and find people living in a pretty pristine hunter-gatherer way of life. These are all what are called band hunter-gatherers. They live in small bands, ranging from 20 to 50 people per band, counting children. And the bands are autonomous. They govern themselves separately from other bands, but they know people in other bands, and people move back and forth from one band to another. And the bands are semi-nomadic. They move around from place to place over kind of circumscribed territory as they follow the available game and vegetation, edible vegetation. And so this is similar among hunter-gatherers no matter where they have been found, whether in Africa or Asia or South America or towards the North Pole, no matter where they're found, no matter what kind of environment they're in, this characterizes hunter-gatherer groups. And the other thing that my survey revealed, but also there have been other studies. I looked not only at the people that I interviewed, but I read whatever I could. And there are certain similarities about every single one of these band hunter-gatherer groups, which is quite remarkable. And that is that children are not expected to do any real work, that they are playing and exploring from dawn to dusk, as one of the anthropologists said, on their own, with other kids. Not that they're segregated from adults. They can observe adults whenever they want. They can participate with adults if the adults and the adults generally allow them to participate, as long as they're not being too disruptive. But there's no such thing as school. There's very little direct instruction. You might be told, somebody will tell you what the really poisonous mushrooms are. Don't eat those. They'll give you those kinds of things that you might not otherwise pick up and could be seriously dangerous. These are not negligent adults. They'll explain those things. But the expectation is that children learn by observing, by playing, by exploring, and they need lots of time to do that. And so you give them time to do that. And so what was fascinating to me is that the philosophy of the hunter-gatherer adults, when they're asked, their philosophy of education is essentially the same as the philosophy of education of the people who founded the Sudbury Valley School. You don't need to teach kids. What you need to do is allow them space and time and opportunity and facilities for learning. And it's good that they have access to experts, but don't force your expertise on them. If they want help, you give it. So in a hunter-gatherer culture, some kid who trying to figure out how to make an arrowhead, who wants a demonstration from some adult expert, the adult expert won't hold back. Oh yeah, sure, let me show you. That happens all the time, and that happens at Sudbury Valley School, but it's never initiated by the adult. It's only initiated by the kid. So this was the phenomenal interesting thing to me. This began to help me understand why Sudbury Valley works so well. What it does in a certain sense is it provides for our time and our culture the kind of learning space that children had throughout human history until the last speck of evolutionary time. It provides the kind of natural environment for learning where children are free. They've got lots of time. There are adults, experts available that you can go to if you want to go to for help. You have access to all the tools of the culture. And perhaps most important, and this has been the focus of a lot of my research, children are not segregated by age. Children are mixed by age, and they're playing together across ages. And the younger kids are constantly learning from the older kids. And the older kids, in a different way, are learning from the younger kids. They're learning how to lead, how to help, how to nurture, how to explain things to somebody who wants something explained. And so the play is mixed by age in a hunter-gatherer group, just as it is at Sudbury Valley. So little kids who aren't very good with a bow and arrow yet are playing with bows and arrows with kids who are good. And the kids who are good are kind of boosting them along to be better. At Sudbury Valley, kids who don't know how to read are playing maybe video games that involve reading some words with kids who do know how to read. And the kids who do know how to read are boosting them up to how to read. I mean, this is just an example, but in every single realm of learning, the older kids are naturally, not because they're deliberately trying to educate the younger ones, but naturally, just to be able to play with them, they're boosting them up into higher levels of activity. I have become convinced that this is the natural way that human beings become educated. And it occurred throughout most of human history in hunter-gatherer cultures, I believe. And when we can replicate that in our culture, learning becomes so much more pleasant, so much more efficient than when we try to force children to learn as we do in our schools.
One thing I wanted to ask you about on this hunter-gatherer observations was, have you thought about, and is there a guard against, I guess what I would call romance or a naturalistic fallacy, a kind of, it's the best example is like the movie Avatar. Like people watch Avatar and it's like, oh, this unspoiled nature it was a better time back then. And what you're explaining rhymes with that mentality a little bit. I want to make sure I understand, because it kind of rubs against me. I've come to feel like this is often a feeling that takes us down the wrong path. So do you know what I'm getting at? Like, how do you guard against the possibility that either the way this has been observed has a certain romance to it, or that or that are there limits to the applicability of that hunter-gatherer experience?
Yeah, well, this is a very common response to this. First of all, I don't generally romanticize hunter-gatherer living, and nor do I romanticize the 1950s. I might seem to when I talk about how I was free to play. Let's be honest, there are some ways in which we've progressed, and in some ways in which things have gotten worse. I don't romanticize the fact that in the 1950s, there were still people getting polio. There were still people, there was a lot more beating of wives than there was today, because there was no way for women to make a living, or much reduced opportunity for there were drunken husbands coming home and beating their wives, sometimes beating their kids. There was, I don't want to go back to the 1950s, but I want to say, look, there's one thing that was better in the 1950s. And that's the fact that children were much freer then than they are today. So there's one thing that was a hell of a lot better in hunter-gatherer cultures than in our culture today, and that's that children were a lot freer than they are today.
What drove the creation of this age-bracketed, structured schooling concept? I mean, from your perspective, and I know there's a lot of there are different tellings of this history, and
Yeah.
The romantic one is which is often used to sort of defend the status quo, is to say, oh well, public school in America built the middle class, and that's why it's such it should be a venerated institution, and of course it sandblasts away that today's public school experience. It might be very, very different than the school experience that built the middle class, but there was still school, right? I mean, school goes back way past the 1950s. Like, how did we get school? How did we go to school,
Right.
take your lunchbox? How did we get 6th, 7th, 8th grade? Where did that stuff come from?
Yeah, so school as we kind of know it today really had its origin. This is my story is a little different from the one that you will often hear from people who, in other ways, hold similar views to mine about schooling. Most people talk about the Industrial Revolution as the origin of schools and how it was designed to train people to be robots on on assembly lines and to know a minimum amount of reading and arithmetic so that they could understand directions, but mostly so they could do a lot of boring work and so on. That's a very common way of explaining why school came about.
It rhymes with the robber barons narrative.
Yeah,
Vanderbilt
exactly.
needed workers, and so blah blah blah.
And there is definitely some truth to that story, but the schools as we know them today go back before that period. The schools that we know about today were first developed most fully in Prussia, what now is largely Germany. Prussia was back in really going back to the 17th century. Prussia was dominated by Protestantism. The Protestant Reformation was a period of time when schools arose. And the reason that schools arose, and it was that the Protestants believed that it's very important for everybody to be able to read the Bible. Unlike the Catholics, they believe that you need to get truth directly from the Bible yourself, not indirectly by way of a church hierarchy, as the Catholics believed.
Right. At that point, you'd go to Catholic Mass, and the priest would face away from you and read it in Latin, which you maybe didn't understand.
Exactly. But
as a Catholic, I can appreciate that.
It didn't matter that you understood it or not. The priest would tell you directly what you needed to do or not do. And so, but the Protestants believed that truth lay in the Bible and that you needed to confront that truth yourself individually. So immediately that meant that for salvation, you better be able to read. So we're dealing with large groups of people at this time who are illiterate, who don't know how to read. So schools developed partly to promote literacy, to be able to read, so that you could read the Bible. And the first schools were in Prussia. And I've actually looked back, because I wrote a little chapter for Free to Learn on the history of schools, and I've delved a little bit more further into it since then. But the person who was most responsible for the development of the Prussian school system was a pietist priest, a pietist minister, I guess the term would be. This was the version of Protestantism. And he became sort of the director of schools in Prussia. He wrote manuals for school masters. They were men at that time, school masters who were in front of the classroom and who ran the classrooms. And these schools were the first to have a curriculum where you go through sort of grade 1, grade 2, and so on and so forth. They were the first to have timed lessons. You would have hourglasses timing the lesson. Everybody would sit in their seats facing the schoolmaster, and the job was to learn the lessons taught by the schoolmaster. What the handbook that was developed for schoolmasters stated very clearly that the major goal, even though it's important to teach reading and it's important to teach children the knowledge of the Bible, so indoctrination, biblical indoctrination was what is meant by knowledge in those days, in that setting. The most important thing is to suppress the child's willfulness, to suppress free will. The belief was the belief at that time.
And I'm not some theological expert.
Sure.
Was this a Calvinist streak, or was it?
This was Calvinist. This was very Calvinist. This was, Calvin, of course, but this was Luther. This was the Protestant leaders in general.
Gotcha.
So at that time, willfulness is the playground of the devil. Free will, we are born in sin, and our free will leads us to sinful behavior. And the only way you can counter that sin is to suppress the child's willfulness and teach the child to obey. So obedience instruction became the primary. It was very clear, your primary task is to teach obedience. To the degree that you impart knowledge, which means knowledge about the Bible, and to the degree that you teach the children to read, that's all good. But keep in mind that your primary job is to suppress and reshape the child's will. So what the child will want to do is follow the orders of those people who are above him. That includes, first and foremost, the schoolmaster himself, who is now, in some sense, standing for God. It includes, even more than the schoolmaster, the child's father. It includes the local, the parish ministers, and ultimately it includes God. So the purpose of school is to teach you that you do not you are basically a sheep, and your job is to follow those who know better. That was the explicit purpose of the early schools. Now, and that purpose spread. So it soon occurred in the colonies too. Massachusetts, my state of Massachusetts, was the first colony to have compulsory schooling, and it was Protestant run. It was the reader that was used, the reading primer, was colloquially called the Little Bible of New England. Children learned to read verses about how, their earliest reading was verses about how if they disobeyed, they would go into hell and burn forever. These were what little children learned to read on. The alphabet was taught, A stands for Adam, and the apple, and so on and so forth, on through Z. Zacharias, who climbed the tree, his Lord to see. and so on. All of it was biblically oriented, and a lot of it was about eternal life in hell if you disobey and if you tell lies or if so on. It was designed to scare the wits out of little kids.
In your book, it's such a provocative summary of that, but it's hard to avoid it. Is you say, okay, so what do you have when you have a compulsory institutionalization? So you have to put your kids into school by law, or you'll go to jail. And then what will be done to them there is they will be forced to suppress their urges and conform to being told what to do. And we have an institution for that. Today, the same construction team is usually build both. It's called a prison. and it's incredibly provocative when you first bring it in the book. But, just in hearing you sort of describe the purpose, it doesn't sound in any way indistinguishable from the purpose of prison. We put criminals in prison because we believe that their will, if they express it, is dangerous and destructive, and so they have to be reformed. I mean, how much reform actually happens in actual prison is another matter, but so school as prison was is that a fair summary, that basically school began as prison for children?
Yeah, and probably even, I use the term prison for other reasons, but reformatory would probably be a better term. The idea, quite literally, children are born needing to be reformed because they are born in original sin. They are basically born to be evil, born to go to hell, unless they get shaped out of that. And to be shaped out of that, they've got to read and understand the Bible. They've got to follow the dictates of the Bible, and they've got to follow those people who can tell them the road to righteousness versus the road to hell. So that was very clear. Now, later on, the schools were taken over by states. As the power of religion fell, the very same institutions were taken over by state governments, and the orientation changed a little bit. And no longer, the doctrine then was not the doctrine of the Bible, but the doctrine of nationalism, by and large.
Yeah, elaborate on that, because you talk about this the Prussian German nationalism that comes to be part of the school and part of the culture there, and it's hard not to see, connect the dots between that and what happens in the 20th century.
I mean, state leaders everywhere fell upon schools, became places. This is where we're going to train people to be good soldiers. We're going to train people to believe that our nation is the best nation in the world, that our people are better than other people, that our language is the pure language, and so on. Germany was especially good at that, and we know what ultimately happened in Germany.
Can you, give me some tangible. You had some tangible examples of what that looked like in the German schools, the Prussian schools, and is this part of the Bismarck era? Is that part of what was bringing that change about in Prussia?
Well, I'm probably not the greatest expert on that aspect of it. So we'd have to. I'm not really prepared to talk in any detail about that. But it is interesting. The point I really want to make up is the whole world went for this. I don't want to necessarily pursue exactly what happened in Germany and the relations, but the whole world went for this. Napoleon was very interested.
Gotcha. So it was broad.
The whole world went for it. And what happened in the United States is, as we became a nation, and as we became as the power of religion fell, schools arose, and it wasn't really until the middle of the 19th century, until about 1850 or 1860, that again it was Massachusetts became the first state to have compulsory state-run, government-run education. And other states began to follow suit, and it wasn't until the early 20th century that some of the southern states had it. So this is a relatively new phenomenon of state-run compulsory education. But when you look at the literature promoting the state-oriented compulsory education in the United States, again, the large argument was we need an obedient citizenry. We need people who will conform to what we believe is correct in the United States. Now, there's a good way of looking at this, and then there's a more sinister way of looking at this. And it's even hard to tell which is which. It partly depends upon your point of view about a lot of things. But we were a nation of immigrants, lots of people coming to the United States. And so on the good side, you could say, well, school is sort of helping to create the melting pot. We had this melting pot idea. Everybody's going to become Americans, no matter where they're coming from. And the way you become an American is you go to school and you become Americanized. You learn American history. You learn to speak the English language. You learn the things that other people in America are learning. You take civics classes and to learn about government and so on and so forth. So that became a lot of the rationale. But at the same time, when you read the writings, there was constant fear of revolution. There was fear of people usurping power in a way that would be disruptive to the powers that be in the United States. And so, the other side of the coin was we still want people to be sheep in a sense, right? We don't want people, it wasn't so much, even by the time we had compulsory schools, illiteracy was not really much of a problem in the United States. People could read and write, and the bigger concern was if they were reading the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
They didn't want people reading, stuff that was going to cause a revolution. They didn't want people reading radical beliefs. They wanted people to, so that was a bigger concern. And so having a curriculum where you're teaching everybody these lessons that lead you to love America and American history, and you're not being taught about the massacre of the Native Americans. You're not being taught that slavery is evil. You're being taught the stuff that fits with the way society is going at that time.
Well, and I understand that pretty substantial voices in that movement in the mid 1800s were also responding to waves of Catholic immigration, and Catholics were coming over and starting their own Catholic schools. And so
yes.
These were the effort was, well, we have to get these Catholics and their loyalty to the Pope into government schools that will disabuse them of that and make them loyal to the U.S. instead of being papists. And I know that there was pretty strong, one of the many sort of fears was like, oh, we're gonna have like a papist revolution, that they won't care about the president, the Pope will be their guy. I mean, the echoes of that Catholic sort of terror lingered even up to the JFK election, where there was this question of, well, will he be beholden to Rome because he's Catholic as a president?
Right. Yeah, now we have that fear about Muslims, right? So it doesn't go away.
No, yeah, Sharia law and all of that.
Yeah, right. So the larger point I'm making regarding the origin of schools and schools today is that schools arose for indoctrination and obedience training. They were designed for that. Now, most people who go into teaching today do not believe they're going into teaching in order to indoctrinate children and teach obedience. So they think they're going into teaching for all kinds of reasons that we would all think are really great reasons. They want to generate a love for learning. They want to promote creativity. They want to promote critical thinking, and so on and so forth. But the point is, schools were never designed for that. They were designed for the opposite of that. They were designed to promote indoctrination and obedience training, and the design has not changed. In some ways, for periods of time, the design has loosened up, And so it's allowed some of that. But the basic design was not for that. You would never design a school that looks like the schools we have today if your purpose was to promote creativity, love of learning, critical thinking, and those kinds of things. There's no way you would design a school like our schools today if that's what your purpose was. But history repeats itself. We design these schools, it becomes a bureaucracy. There becomes all kinds of vested interest in keeping it kind of the same way. And so all those schools change a little bit. They don't change in their basic design. We've got the same basic design that those people in Prussia had in the 17th century, where it was very clear the purpose was indoctrination and obedience training. We haven't changed the design. So you go into a school, maybe you're the most idealistic teacher you can imagine. And in education school, you read sort of progressive theories about education, you read about the value of play, you read about this and that, and now you're in a school. You're in real school. There's 30 kids in your class. You're being told, okay, you have to test the children at these various times. You are being measured. You, as the teacher, are being measured on whether or not the children pass these tests or do well on these tests. And here's what the tests assess. All right, so you've got to get the kids to do that. How are you going to get the kids to do that? There's no way with 30 kids in the classroom, there's no way they're all going to be interested in that. No way on any given day they're all going to be interested in the same aspect of that. There's no way if you're teaching first grade that every kid is going to have an interest in knowing how to read or be really actually ready for learning how to read. The only way you're going to do your job is to make children do what they don't want to do. It's the only possible way for you to do your job because of the way we've constructed schools, because we have this curriculum, because we put these bunch of kids together and they're all supposed to be doing the same things at the same time and learning the same things at the same time. But that's not human nature. And so it's not going to happen by any of these natural means that children learn. So it can only happen by coercive means, by basically use of reward and punishment to get them to do that. And so as I often say, and I think this is absolutely true, the only way you can fail in school is by not doing what you're told to do. If you do what you're told to do, you'll pass. The only way you can pass is by doing what you're told to do. If you consistently don't do what you're told to do, you will fail. So what is the real lesson of school? To do what you're told to do.
If I'm a teacher, there's a lot of what I'm hearing that I think resonates in what you're describing. I have family and friends who went into teaching and have pretty early left as a result, both at all levels, because of the strictures that are placed on them and this reality that's so much different than what they had imagined, exactly as you've described it. They come and they say, well, how am I supposed to inspire my kids? How am I supposed to accomplish what I think my job is, which is to make them lifelong learners and to help them discover their potential and these things that I think we all want for our kids. And instead they're on a rail, trying to jump through these milestones, these artificial milestones and these artificial tests that are testing things that no adult cares about or will ever ask them about ever in any job interview, or any investor for their prospective startup, or any donor to their prospective nonprofit. Nobody cares about any of this stuff in the real world. But when I look at a Sudbury or Acton or a lot of these others, the role of the teacher in that particular model, but in several of these, is greatly diminished. I mean, at my son's school, one of the cardinal rules is that the adults are not to answer questions. It's radically Socratic, so they can only ask questions. If I come out with all these pedagogies in my head and all these expectations of what teaching is, what does a Peter Gray future offer me as a teacher?
Yeah, well, so a Peter Gray future, if it ever came about, and I dearly hope it's not called that, so, is uh, is a future in which there will not be schools of education. We won't need schools of education and we won't need people called teachers. We will need people who are willing to teach in their area of expertise. We will need people who are great musicians who are willing to share their knowledge of the instrument with somebody who comes to them and says, I want to learn from you. We will need people in medical school who can teach people how to do surgery, because I don't want somebody to practice surgery on me by trial and error. I want them to know how to do surgery before they ever do surgery on me. We will need people to teach electricians how to how to set up circuits and so on that don't burn houses down and so on and so forth. We will need people who can teach, but we won't need teachers as such. We won't need pedagogues. There will be no science of education, because there never was a science of education.
It's a bold statement, Peter.
Because education emerges from the child. The child educates himself. At Sudbury Valley, nobody's called a teacher. If anything, having a degree from an education school is a disadvantage as a staff member at Sudbury Valley, because you're too inclined to want to intervene, and if you intervene the way a teacher does at Sudbury Valley, you will have broken one of the rules of the school, and you'll be brought up by somebody to the judicial committee for interfering in somebody's ongoing activities. So we just won't need. So this is one reason why people in schools of education are not particularly interested in Sudbury Valley. Right?
Peter, your world, which I have to say is my world too, it would say, go do something else.
Right, exactly. So
pursue your own dream that's got some specificity to it.
So I've written a blog post on my ideal future, and I actually think this will come about, because I think it makes so much sense, and I think there's a certain sense in which, in a very small way, it's beginning to occur. So I sort of, in this blog post, I describe sort of a three-phase view of education, three stages of it that the young person goes through. So the first stage is the stage that I call discovering yourself and the world around you. And that basically is like a Sudbury Valley school. You're in a setting where there's lots of opportunity to play, to explore, to try different things, to learn about the world. Ideally, you would have opportunity to travel some. Whether there's a lot of field trips that are optional, you could go on. This is a stage of discovery, and it's taking advantage of the we're all born extraordinarily curious. We're curious about the world around you. And the curiosity is the motive for learning what you see around you, trying to figure things out. We play, we discover through play what we enjoy doing, what we're good at, what we like to do. We discover, as I often say, our passions in play. That's what play is following your passions. And so at some point, maybe around 15, 16 years old, maybe be about sort of typical high school graduation age today, you're now ready. You now have some idea about how you might want to make a living. Maybe this isn't how you would always make a living, but you're beginning to think, look, I can't live with my parents all my life. I'm going to have to make a living somehow. How might I want to make a living? So the next stage is the stage that we could call a stage of apprenticeships, stage of trying out a career, in a sense, trying out. So whether you're an apprentice or an intern, or whether you're working at a low level position within the general career activity that you're interested in, you spend some time doing that. So, let's say that for one reason or another, you've reached 15, 16 years old, and you think you want to be a doctor, and kind of you're exploring your experiences in life. You just think, that you would be a good doctor, that you would enjoy being a doctor, it'd be a meaningful career, you'd be helping people, and so on and so forth. So the next stage would be then to test that out. Would I really like to be a doctor? I've been to doctors, I've read about doctors, I have some sense of what it's like to be a doctor, but I've never really been in a hospital. I've never really been around sick people all that much. I don't know exactly what doctors do. So now you work at some low level within a medical setting. Maybe you're an orderly in a hospital. Maybe you're an assistant to a nurse. But you're doing something where you're in a medical environment and you're now getting a real taste of what it's like. And you're seeing, would I be good? Am I good at this kind of thing? Can I tolerate it? But do I really have the patience it takes? Do I really have the love it takes, or whatever it is, to do the kind of work that a good doctor does? And so let's say that the answer to that is no. No, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, but now that I'm really here, so then maybe I'll try, well, maybe I would rather be a chef. I also kind of like cooking and so on and so forth. And so now you apprentice yourself as a cook at a restaurant and so on. But or let's say on the other hand, yeah, I do like this, and you work a few years there, and maybe you kind of work your way up to the degree that you can without actually becoming a doctor. And then at some point you say, yeah, I really am ready now to become a doctor. So the next stage would be to go to medical school. I would do away with 4-year liberal arts, which I think is a waste of time. I would then go to medical school, and and to get into medical school, you may have to do certain things. First of all, you would probably have to have recommendations from the doctors you've been working with, who would say, this person has the qualities it takes to be a good doctor. He's got the disposition for it. I've seen how kind he is to people who are ill. I've seen his intelligence in operation in this and that way. So that would be part of it. But maybe the medical school would say, well, but there's a certain amount of kind of biochemistry and that kind of stuff that you have to learn. So to accept you, you're going to also have to take a course in organic chemistry or this or that beforehand. So some schools would open up which would teach you exactly that you could take this course. So now this would be a course. It would be a formal course, but you're taking it because the medical school is requiring it and asking you to have it as proof that you can do that part of what it is. You've proven that you could do, in a sense, the practical part, but can you do the study part that has to do with theory of disease and so on and so forth? So you do that, and then you apply to medical school, and then you go to medical school, and then you become a doctor. So that's the 3 phases. The first phase is learning who you are. The second phase is testing out a career through apprenticeships. In some cases, the apprenticeship can lead directly to the career. You don't need to go to some sort of professional training. But in those cases where a person's life could depend upon it, where the kind of cases where we want people to be licensed, we want to know that the people who are licensed know all the up-to-date techniques, that they know the standard practices, they know how to avoid the dangers, they know the history of what works and doesn't work. In those cases, we would want people to be certified by showing that they've gone through the kind of professional training. So that's the system that I would look for. And I think that if we had a system like that, we would have far fewer unhappy doctors and unhappy lawyers and unhappy businessmen, and far more happy ones. And we would also have a lot more people who are doing things that they really love to do, but which currently people might avoid because they think it's lower level. Whether it's daycare for young children, or being a forest ranger, or truck driver, or whatever, people would go into what they enjoy doing. It's one of the go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the world you're describing, in one way, sounds radical, and in another way, to me at least, sounds like something we all, over the age of 25, are familiar with. It's called the rest of your life.
Exactly.
Which is, you get out of school, And then
Right.
for most people, you're now saying, what do I do now? And you get a
Right.
bunch of different jobs, and some stick, some don't. Some companies feel good, and then they have a, you go through a session and you lose your job, and you look around, you buy a course to learn how to do some coding or to learn how to do uh, sales, and then you
Right.
you take some other training, you get another job, and life goes on. And what it seems like,
Right.
which I mean, and for me, it rings especially true because a big part of the work I do now was spawned out of self-interested pursuit of understanding economics outside of a school context. I was teaching myself economics on the bus while I was going into New York to work in
Uh-huh.
children's television and work at Spike TV. Um, so the thing that's ironic then is, so you're advocating for a quote. I almost hate saying it's a system, but an early stage of life that looks like the rest of life. And what we do now instead is say, hey, here is this first, let's say 20 years starting at age 4 or 5. These are the years where you have the most energy, where your mind is the most pliable and adaptable. It's where it's the easiest at the early stages for you to learn a language or to pick up a skill. And we're going to basically put that all in some painful, regimented prison system. And then good luck out there in the world for the rest.
Right. Right. And one of the things that I found in uh, my follow-up studies of graduates in Sudbury Valley and also follow-up studies of grown unschoolers. So these are people ostensibly as homeschoolers, but who are allowed to follow their own interests. And these are people who are in families. This does require some resources at home, families that can connect their children to a lot of learning opportunities outside of the home and so on. So I've studied grown unschoolers as well as graduates of Sudbury Valley School. And here's what's common about them is that a very high percentage of them go on to careers that they absolutely love. And many of them are careers that the typical school kid would never have heard of. They're careers that, and the way this happens, in about 50% of the cases of these studies, 50% of these case histories, in a way, if I look at them that way, these people are doing as a career the same thing that they were doing in play as a child. They played at various things. They discovered what they love to do, and then they figured out how to make a living doing it. And so these are the people who say, I'm so lucky. My work is my passion. My work is what I would be, even if I didn't need the money, I would still be doing this because I love it. That's fairly rare in our world that people have that attitude, but it's not rare among people in self-directed education. And so let me take the example of doctor. Just, my wife is a doctor, and so
Yeah, my dad's a
I'm,
doctor, so I appreciate it.
and my wife became a doctor by being a nurse first. So this is one way that I kind of one of the realms by which I come to this way of thinking. But the typical person who becomes a doctor, so they get the idea they might want to be a doctor, and maybe they don't even really want to be a doctor, but they're encouraged to be a doctor, right? By their parents or by society. A doctor, a lot of prestige to being a doctor, and so on. Not so much today as there was in the past, but still. So you get this idea in your head. So the next thing you have to do is to go to 4 years of college where you learn nothing about being a doctor, nothing,
Yeah.
right? And then you apply to medical school. Now, by this point, you've spent a lot of money for 4 years of college, and now you're going to spend a lot more money. You're going to go into great debt to go to medical school, and you still have no sense of what it is to be a doctor. You've invested a lot of your life into it. You've invested a lot of money into it. And now you go to medical school, and at some point, it would be pretty hard to say no. Some people do. Oh no, I really now that I actually am around real patients, I can't stand this. it would be pretty hard to back out of it. You are pretty far along in life. You've invested a lot. By the time you're actually doing doctor-like stuff, you are pretty far in life, and you've wasted a lot of time and a lot of money if you change your career to something else. So this needs to be turned around. You need to get an idea of what it is to be a doctor before you invest all that time and money in it. And it's not just doctor, it's anything else. Let's say you think you want to be a scientist. So how do you become a scientist? You don't learn anything about science in science classes in schools. In school, in science classes, you're doing the opposite of what a scientist does. Scientists ask questions for which we don't know the answer, and then they go about trying to answer it. In science class, you memorize a lot of stuff about what scientists have answered. That has nothing to do with being a scientist, right? It's the opposite of being a scientist. A kid at Sudbury Valley who's collecting frogs down by the stream and trying to figure out, what they are and how they're different, that kid is being a scientist. He's actually learning science, how to do science, what it means to be science. If he decides to go on to become a scientist, he's doing it on the basis of some actual knowledge of what it is to do science in a certain realm of science. So the same is true for anything else. What you are doing in school gives you no idea about any career other than teaching. The only career that you get direct experience of what it's like by going to school is teaching. So you have no sense. School is not preparing you for any career other than teaching, because you aren't learning what it's like to be in that career. So one of the differences between our society and hunter-gatherer societies is our children don't naturally grow up understanding what even their own parents do with their job, because we segregate children from the career. Children in hunter-gatherer cultures have a pretty good idea of what it is to hunt and gather and make dugout canoes and build huts and all the things that the adults do, because they see it happen around them. They're not segregated from the adult world. So we need, if we want children to grow up understanding careers and figuring out what career they want to go into, they have to have the opportunity to experience those careers firsthand. And that's basically what I'm trying to accomplish with this system that I'm describing.
As we come to a close on our conversation, it's been so great to dig into this, and having just recently read Free to Learn, it's great to just hear these ideas in a different way. Just having this conversation with you. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is what does it mean, and as a parent, what does it mean to be an adult? And to be an adult that's successful, and I'm using that term very, very broadly. I don't mean financial success. I don't mean status. I mean a sense of success that you would sort of choose for yourself. How would you describe that? Because to me, in a way, I think our job as parents, I think almost every parent would agree that what they want is to set their kids up to succeed as adults. I think that if there's any common denominator, it's I want my kid to succeed. I want them to grow up and succeed. And what that means looks different for every kid and for every parent. And sometimes the parent and the kid have two different ideas, and that can cause some trouble. Like, I want you to be a doctor, and well, Dad, I don't want to be a doctor. And but how do you describe like the attributes of successful adulthood? Like, what's the North Star that, as a parent now, I could walk away from this conversation thinking about as goals for my parenting?
Right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I talk to parents, I'll ask them this. So I want you to think for a little bit. Think kind of deeply. What do you really want for your child? What do you really want to be the characteristics of your child when your child becomes an adult? And to think deeply about it. When people think deeply about it, there's not a lot of differences among people in what they come up with. I want my child to be happy as an adult, to be satisfied. I want my child to be a good person. I want him to give to the world more than he takes. I want him to be a friend to people. I want people to like him as well as him liking other people. And of course, I want him to make a living. I want him to be financially independent of me. Those are what people want. When it comes right down to it, they want their child to be able to make a living, to be able to be financially independent, not beholden to others in society. They want their child to be a moral person. I think almost everybody wants their child to be that. And they want their child to be happy, to live a satisfying life, have a good marriage, be a good parent if they're going to be a parent. Everybody wants that. Another way I sometimes ask it is I say, what would you rather have said at your eulogy when you die? Made it into Harvard or was a good neighbor? Which would you rather have? And everybody says good neighbor. So let's think about that when we think about our kids. And let's not, by pushing them into Harvard, let's not jeopardize their chance of growing up to be happy and a good neighbor and a moral person.
Thank you, Peter, for this great conversation. I hope listeners out there get as much out of your work as I have.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.